FTL, Faster Than Light, is a game that's both very fair and very balanced. Each encounter has a very clear and intuitive solution for you to figure out, and you're never left completely helpless as the game mercilessly screws you over. And you can almost hear the developers laughing at you as you question the life choices you've made that have led you to be obsessed with this evil, cruel, and sadistic game. FTL Faster Than Light is a game that's both punishing and fair. If by punishing we mean getting beaten by lead pipes in a dark alley, and by fair we mean the American healthcare system. Nah, FTL isn't nearly that bad. Okay, so obviously I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the thing is, knowing that the game is actively designed to screw you over means you'll pull out all the stops and do whatever you can to win. Basically, every single choice in this game will put immense pressure on you, and anything short of optimal play will probably lead you to an early grave in the vacuum of space. FTL is a game that forces you to think, and think carefully. Basically, you'll choose which alley to walk down carefully, knowing that one of them has an angry mob at the other side of it with lead pipes waiting for you. Do you remember that one episode of Star Trek Voyager where the crew gets stranded in a big empty void with a bunch of other aliens, and they eventually escape it by cooperating with each other and pooling their resources together? In the end, they escape because of their ability to cooperate with each other and form bonds and trust each other, rather than just their ability to fend for themselves. The characters who are unable to shed their survival of the fittest mindset and cooperate end up getting left behind at the end of the episode. Their inability to see their peers as anything else except prey to be exploited ultimately was their downfall. The message of this episode is very optimistic, and it encourages us to set aside our differences so we can work towards a common, mutually beneficial goal. I think it's a great message, and I think it's one that if we took to heart, maybe as a species, we'd be better off.
We've got to stick to our principles, not abandon them.
Should the crew be ready to die for those principles?
If the alternative means becoming thieves and killers ourselves, yes. But I'm betting that our principles are going to keep us alive.
Meanwhile, FTL takes that message, spits on it, throws it in a dumpster, lights the dumpster on fire, then throws it off a cliff.
Making the mother of all omelets here, Jack. Can't spread over every egg. Can't hurt me, Jack. Nanomachine, son. Die, you piece of shit!
FTL's universe is very harsh and unforgiving, and it basically leaves you with no other choice other than to take your survival into your own hands. Simply put, trust and cooperation really isn't much of a thing here. I mean, you can try, but I wouldn't get your hopes up. To be fair, sometimes you can trust somebody, but when you learn how badly it can go when you do it too easily, then you always make decisions with that possibility in the back of your head. Basically, you'll come to realize that it's always best to make decisions with you and your crew as your top priority rather than anybody else. Look, all I'll say is, if you trust too easily, then things like this will happen to you often. In other games, you might be tempted to make decisions based on a moral compass of some kind, either your own or maybe the one of the character that you're role-playing has, but FTL is a bit different. Resources are extremely scarce, so you have to approach every single encounter in the game with this in mind. For example, for surviving this encounter, I got 13 scrap, and if I want to get level 2 shields in order to stay ahead of the scaling danger of the enemy ships, then I'm going to need exactly 100 scrap. And that's assuming that I only focus on upgrading the shields, and I completely ignore every other opportunity that presents itself along the way. If I don't do everything that I can to maximize the amount of scrap that I'm bringing in, then it won't be long until the enemy ships just completely get ahead of me, and I won't even be able to get through their shields. I also need to be aware of how much damage I take as well, because the more damage I take, the more money that I'll spend on repairs instead of purchasing upgrades like better systems and better weapons and upgrading current systems and things like that. There's no worse feeling than getting to a shop and being just shy of being able to afford cloaking, it really makes you think, what can I have done to have increased my scrap gain in order to have afforded it? Asking yourself that question as much as possible is really important because it's how you win the game. On your, let's be honest, most likely hopeless and doomed mission to defeat the Rebel flagship, you're gonna need a lot of scrap, which is a really scarce resource, and especially on hard mode, which I think you should be playing on in order to really appreciate the pressure that this game puts on you in order to make good decisions. Knowing how scarce scrap is and how difficult the game can be at times, you always ask that question, that is, how can I gain more scrap from this encounter? And when you learn the game enough and you know its systems, then the answers to this question can get pretty unhinged. Which brings me to the most common choice that you'll be presented with in any given run, that is, to accept surrender or not. The answer is almost always no. While a surrendering enemy can offer you more fuel, missiles, or drone parts occasionally, you'll always get more scrap from finishing them off, as far as I know. And as I mentioned earlier, every upgrade that you'll need to win the game costs scrap. That fuel might be temporarily useful, but in the end, scrap is really what you want. Also adding to this is the fact that the game is notoriously unfair. Maybe it's just that on hard mode the enemies have more upgraded engines, but it really isn't that uncommon to see all of your shots miss while the enemies just connect effortlessly. It isn't just combat that can be unfair. The game will regularly force you into events where one or more of the outcomes can be utterly devastating. And oftentimes there's no way to know which option will present a positive outcome, sometimes it's randomized too. Ask any experienced player what they have to say about the Rock Live Mine event, and I'm sure you'll get an interesting answer. And hey, if you don't believe me about the game being unfair, then don't take my word for it, take the word of the developers. Remember that clip from the intro? Well, during that encounter, I got 0 scrap because the enemy got away, which means that that jump was just wasted. Given that you only have a limited number of jumps each sector as an opportunity to make scrap, that means I'm behind now and I'm going to have to compensate for that. Well, I think you should know what that means by now.
Kill or be killed, Jack!
Basically, FTL is a game where you play as the evil Janeway from Living Witness. No, you know what? Actually, that's the best way to describe the game. Video's over.
Double the yield.
Captain, don't you think that's excessive?
Preparing to fire again.
To be fair, there is a little bit of a caveat to all of this, in that sometimes it actually is more advantageous to accept surrender, because you might need more fuel in that moment in order to not be prey to the advancing rebel fleet. So there are some times where you might be persuaded to do something good or merciful, but I find it interesting that you will only do that if it has a direct benefit to you, not just because. So in the end, you are still acting like a cold, pragmatic survivalist. And besides, these situations are few and far between, so 99% of the time you're going to be taking the more scrap instead. Just be aware of how much fuel you have, and make your decision based on that. Think carefully, remember? Rather than letting you make decisions based on a moral compass, like in a lot of other games, FTL in a way doesn't actually give you a choice, because you always have to choose the one that'll benefit you the most in the end, otherwise you'll just lose. And there's a lot of nuance to doing this that will require you to think critically about a lot of different situations. For example, if you can kill the enemy crew while leaving their ship intact, then that'll net you more resources than the alternative would. The most common way to do this is the high risk, high reward crew teleporter. but if you're creative enough, there's also a lot of other ways to do it too. Even something as simple as just jumping to another beacon can have a lot of nuance to it as well. On the topic of risk-reward scenarios, sometimes you might actually want to open yourself up to the Rebel fleet so you can just get one more beacon. That beacon can make a world of difference, or it can be your undoing. Or, maybe that reckless dive you just did was just enough to afford cloaking and a flak cannon. So yeah, winning or losing your run could theoretically depend on one single decision. Yeah, no pressure though, right? So the point behind all of my unhinged rambling so far is that FTL is a game that forces you to think carefully about every choice you make because everything you do has profound consequences, and because of the permadeath mechanic, Permanence, it's possible that making only one wrong call can tank your entire run and turn it into a failure. That could be taking on a fight that you can't handle, or passing up a really good weapon in a shop, or not conserving your scrap enough so that you don't have all of your system slots filled out by the end of the game. And yes, arguably most importantly, passing up on opportunities to make scrap. And once you make one of these mistakes, it's permanent. You can't just undo it by reverting to a save file. So think carefully about everything you do. When you're playing FTL skillfully, then you're becoming the captain that the Kyrians believed Janeway to be in the episode of Star Trek Voyager Living Witness. You are a cold, calculating, destructively pragmatic and callous captain who's willing to do anything to survive. Not only does this provide an interesting, cruel, and bleak style of world-building for the game, but it also demands informed and tactical decision-making from the player constantly. And all of this really works because of how difficult and arguably unfair the game is, and especially because of the permadeath mechanic. This strategic and tactical mindset that you'll eventually settle into is all a result of the fact that the game puts immense pressure on you. If this pressure wasn't there, and you could just maybe revert to a save file when you didn't like the outcome of a decision you made, then there wouldn't be any reason to stop and to think carefully about everything you do. You could instead rely on things like brute forcing instead of actual tactical decision making. If you've seen my other video by any chance, then you'll know that I think consequences are really important for immersion in video games. I talked a lot about how Dark Souls 3 fails as a sequel to Dark Souls 1 because it lacks meaningful consequences. As a result, the game never really pulls you into its world the same way that Dark Souls 1 did. There's no reason to carefully consider the choices you make in that game when ultimately it won't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, Dark Souls leverages its consequences better in terms of immersion, but both games present you with choices that can have long-lasting or even permanent effects on your playthrough. In both games, it also makes the experience more varied and memorable, because each playthrough will have a different set of consequences to deal with. If you could just retry a fight in FTL after you lose to it, then the immense pressure to make good decisions simply wouldn't be there, similar to how in Dark Souls 3 you can just warp out of dangerous areas. The pressure just isn't there, and so challenge and immersion are both diminished. If a game is making you feel stressed, then it's likely that you're immersed in it, or at the very least susceptible to being immersed in it. Logically, it shouldn't make you feel stressed, because if you lose, then you can just turn off the game and go about your day-to-day life like nothing happened. At worst, you lose maybe an hour or two of your time. And even if you win, you technically don't have any material benefit to show for that. I mean, it's all fake. So, in a way, practically speaking, winning and losing in a game aren't really any different from each other. But you want to win. You want to save the galaxy. You want to survive. You want to link the fire, because you're immersed. Or, maybe you just don't want to miss out on that sweet, sweet dopamine rush of seeing the flagship break apart after you win. Speaking of dopamine, unless you're a babbling loser who's had his brain fried by a lifetime pursuit of hedonism and instant gratification, then you probably also care about other things in games, like the story or the characters. While I do think that FTL's choices are compelling from a strategic standpoint, the problem for immersion at least is that FTL doesn't really have a fleshed out world or characters worth caring about or relating to. As such, it's very easy to fall into a rhythm of only making optimal choices from a strategic standpoint and not really caring about any implications it might have to those characters or morally. Basically, any experienced player is only going to see numbers and probabilities and potential rewards instead of characters with their own backstories and motives. Which, to be fair, is fine because FTL is a game about tactics and strategy, not narrative investment. But for another type of game, it isn't quite as nuanced as it maybe could be. If there was complex, character-driven writing to go with these choices, then I think that they would be a lot more interesting and difficult to make. Because if the characters were fleshed out enough to be worth caring about, then you would have to consider the consequences of your actions from that angle as well, not just from a mechanical standpoint. Of course, I can only speak for myself, but if I had to wager, I would bet that there's a lot of people like me who tend to get very attached to characters in fiction, especially video games. If I'm invested in the characters, then I'm more likely to also make decisions with their interests in mind and not just my own. FTL kind of fails on this front because it simply doesn't really have characters. If the characters that you blatantly screw over on any given playthrough of this game had any semblance of depth to them, then you might think twice about doing that. Because their existence is limited to only a short few lines of dialogue in a text box, it's easier just to see them as gameplay mechanics to be exploited. And so immersion is ultimately broken. I know that this is kind of subjective, but if you ask me, there's very little reason to care about any of the characters in this game because their existence is just so short-lived. Wait a minute. Numbers. To be exploited? Oh no, that's the point, isn't it? In any case, if you had to weigh your attachment and investment in a character against your own motive to survive and win the game, then the choices would be a lot more multifaceted and challenging. Then it would be like, yeah, I mean, you won, but at what cost? This is kind of difficult because FTL is ultimately just a piece of fiction at the end of the day. Even with complex character writing and a variety of different motivations for each choice, then it's still possible that a lot of players would still just pick the option that's most advantageous to themselves. But I still think that there's a good reason to believe that there are a lot of players out there who would still make choices that benefit the characters that they love. Seeing a character you love get a happy ending or closure to their story is just as valid of a motivation as more loot or XP, in my opinion. And I think juxtaposing these motivations rather than having them exist within the same outcome could make for some really interesting choices. I don't know about you, but when Rousey told me not to hurt anybody in Deltarune, I was fully on board with it because I like him as a character and I want to do what he says. Even if pacifism doesn't earn you any XP in this game, it's still a lot more worthwhile to me because I would rather see where it takes his story than see a fake number go up a little bit. Given the popularity of the pacifist route in Undertale, I think it's fair to say there's a lot of other people out there like me. The fact that sparing enemies in these games doesn't net you any experience is really interesting in my opinion. In a way, the pacifist route is kind of this game's equivalent to like Soul Level 1 run from Dark Souls, except you have an actual reason to do it outside of just purely intrinsic motivation. For many fans of Deltarune and Undertale, the joy of seeing your favorite character get a happy ending far outweighs the satisfaction you would get from artificial game mechanics like leveling up or discovering loot. Actually, to return to Dark Souls for a moment, Dark Souls 3 has a pretty decent example of what I'm talking about with Greyrat's quest. Greyrat is a very kind character who goes out of his way to help you, and so it's pretty easy to get attached to him. So with this in mind, sending him to die in Lothric Castle is more beneficial to you, but at the same time, is it really worth it? Of course, this is kind of ruined by the fact that the items you get for sending him to die are pitiful, but I think you should at least, in theory, see what I'm talking about here. Despite the mechanical benefit to sending him to Lothric Castle, you're probably tempted to spare him anyway. Well, I guess I can only speak for myself, but I know I always was. Now, if you turned up the pressure on a choice like this, then you'd have a really compelling dilemma on your hands. For example, if you had FTL's permanence and very punishing difficulty, then you'd have to consider a choice like this from many different angles. You want to see a character you like get closure, but you also don't want to see a game over screen or lose something important mechanically. Doing this would make the player make decisions from multiple different angles, while simultaneously playing with several different motivations that they might have. This would make the game more immersive as well, because then you would be making the choice from the perspective of somebody who's really there in the game world, rather than just a player behind a screen looking to optimize their score. Alright, well, those of you who saw my previous video aren't going to be surprised by this, but this is the part where I start gushing about Dark Souls 1. Many of the choices in Dark Souls have the permanence and challenge of FTL, while simultaneously centering them on fleshed out characters. In Dark Souls, making the wrong call can potentially kill a character that you might care about permanently for the rest of your playthrough. So knowing that that's a risk, you'll think carefully about every action you take. And you'll always remember that there's no going back and you'll have to live with whatever consequences you incur. You know, just like real life. This big lady just sits here and does nothing. I wonder if she'll drop a useful item. I mean, she doesn't really seem to be doing anything, and if FTL taught me anything, then it's exploiting characters for resources is always the right way to go.
Thou that tarnisheth the Godmother's image, I am Gwyndolin. And thy transgression shall not go unpunished. Thou shalt perish in the twilight of Anor Londo. Oh, heretic, swathed in dark, an eternal curse upon thee.
Simply put, the knowledge that you'll have to live with any negative consequences makes you stop and carefully think about each choice you make. When you're thinking deeply about whatever decision you're going to make, then it's likely you're immersed in the game, or at the very least invested in it, which I think we can all agree is a good thing. Putting a player in simulated danger is a great way to get them to stop and think, and also immerse them as well. You basically need to threaten them and say, if you mess up, then we'll take something important away from you. For most games, the thing that gets taken away from you is usually just a small amount of progress. Usually a carefully calculated amount of progress by the developers in order to not frustrate you too much. But in a game like FTL, the stakes are much higher when you risk losing your entire run. As a result, you have no choice but to think carefully about every option, because the pressure is immense. As a result, the game is much more thought-provoking than it would be if you could just brute force every encounter without really any incentive to think. Dark Souls, on the other hand, proves that progress isn't the only thing that the developers can take away from you if you mess up. Essential items, covenants, bonfires, characters, nothing is off limits in Dark Souls. And maybe a hypothetical, spiritual sequel to FTL could learn from this approach in order to make the choices even more challenging and thought-provoking. Most games hold themselves back from punishing you too hard because they're afraid of alienating you or frustrating you. But when you notice that the game is holding back, then you remember that you're a player sitting in front of a screen rather than someone who's actually in the world experiencing it. Compared to other mediums, what makes video games special is their ability to immerse you directly into their worlds. But that virtue is ultimately lost on games that are predictable and safe. FTL and Dark Souls are neither predictable nor safe, and I think that they're a lot more immersive and thought-provoking as a result of that. Okay, so I'm not reading from a script anymore, I'm just talking into the microphone, and I have to say that I have to apologize because the video ended up being really unorganized. I didn't really know what I wanted it to be, and so it ended up kind of being a few different things at once, and it isn't really as coherent as the last video, so I apologize for that. Originally, it was only going to be about FTL's permadeath and how it forced you to make careful decisions, but it ended up being about choices in general, and of course I had to include Dark Souls because, you know, of course. Anyway, that's about it, and if you're still watching to this point, thank you so much. I can't even begin to express my gratitude, and I hope you have an amazing day or night. Thank you so much.